There is a beach on the coast of Turkey, near the mouth of a river the ancient Greeks called the Scamander, where the wind still comes in off the water the same way it did 3,000 years ago. If you stood there today, just after sunset, with the waves folding quietly onto the sand and the light draining slow and orange out of the sky, you might be standing on the very ground where a man named Achilles once sat outside his tent, alone, listening to the sea. He was, according to the stories the Greeks told about him for 1,000 years, the greatest warrior who ever lived, faster than any other man, stronger, nearly impossible to kill. And yet the story of his life, when you actually sit with it, slow down and walk through it night by night, campfire by campfire, meal by meal, is not really a story about glory at all. It is a story about a young man who was loved by his mother so fiercely that she tried to make him immortal, who was raised half by a king and half by a wild centaur in the mountains, who fell in love with his closest companion, who lost his temper over a matter of pride and let his own people die for it, and who spent his final days not celebrating a victory, but grieving. Tonight, we are going to walk through that whole life slowly, the way you might walk through an old house by candlelight. We will sit inside the palace where he was born. We will climb the mountain where he learned to hunt. We will board the ships that carried him to war. And we will spend a long, quiet decade camped on a beach outside the walls of Troy, watching the small, human details of a war that history remembers mostly for its bronze and its blood, but which was, day to day, made up of cooking fires, worn sandals, homesick men, and one friendship that changed everything. Get comfortable. There is no need to remember any of this. Just let it settle over you the way firelight settles over a room at the end of a long day. Hey, buddy, welcome back. If this is your first night here, I'm glad you found your way to this quiet corner of the internet. This channel is a place to slow down at the end of the day, dim the lights, and listen to history the way it might have been told a very long time ago, by someone sitting close to a fire, in no particular hurry to finish the story. There is no test at the end. There is nothing to remember. You can drift in and out as you like, and I promise the story will still make sense in the morning, whether you heard every word or none of them. Before we begin, go ahead and get yourself settled. Maybe you are already in bed, the room dark except for the glow of your screen turned down low. Maybe you have a blanket pulled up to your chin, or a cup of something warm cooling on the nightstand. Wherever you are, take a slow breath in and let it out even slower. There is nowhere else you need to be right now. And if you do feel like sticking around for these long, quiet nights of history, I would love it if you considered subscribing. It costs nothing, and it helps this little channel keep doing what it does, which is simply telling long stories slowly for people who want to rest their minds before sleep. Then, if you feel like it, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. I always love picturing all the different corners of the globe where people are lying quietly in the dark, letting these old stories carry them off to sleep. Maybe it's late morning where you are, coffee in hand, half listening while the day gets started. Maybe it's the middle of the night and the house is silent except for my voice. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Tonight's story is the story of Achilles. Not just the famous parts, the duel with Hector, the wrath, the heel that would one day become a saying about weakness. We are going to start much earlier than that, in a small kingdom by the sea, in a world lit only by oil lamps and hearth fires, where a baby boy was born to a mortal king and an immortal sea goddess, and where nobody yet knew that his name would still be spoken, 3,000 years later, by people lying in bed in houses that would have seemed like something out of a myth to the Greeks themselves. Let's go inside. A child by the sea. To understand Achilles, we have to start not with him, but with his parents, because their story is strange enough on its own to deserve a slow walk through it. His father was a man named Peleus, king of a small coastal region in northern Greece called Phthia, tucked along the edge of Thessaly, a rugged stretch of land where the mountains come down close to the sea, and the soil is good for little more than grazing sheep and growing barley in narrow valleys. Peleus was a mortal man, respected, capable, a decent king by the standards of his time, but nothing extraordinary. He would likely have lived a modest, forgettable life, ruling his small kingdom, raising sheep, occasionally going to war with a neighboring town over grazing land, if not for one strange piece of luck, or perhaps one strange piece of misfortune, depending on how you look at it. He was chosen to marry a goddess. Her name was Thetis, one of the 50 daughters of an old sea god named Nereus, spirits of the water who lived beneath the waves and occasionally came up to walk among mortals. Thetis was said to be so beautiful and so favored that both Zeus, king of the gods, and his brother Poseidon, god of the sea, wanted her for themselves. But there was a prophecy whispered among the gods that Thetis was destined to bear a son greater than his father. For an ordinary woman, that would be a blessing. For a goddess desired by the two most powerful gods in the universe, it was a terrifying thought, because if either Zeus or Poseidon fathered a child with Thetis, that child would grow up to be more powerful than his own father, a god capable of overthrowing him. Neither Zeus nor Poseidon wanted a son who might one day take his throne. So instead, the gods arranged for Thetis to marry a mortal man. That way, whatever son she bore would only ever be half a god at most, strong, yes, perhaps even legendary, but never a threat to Olympus itself. Peleus, an ordinary king from an ordinary kingdom, was chosen almost by accident, a safe, unthreatening vessel for the son who was destined to be great. I want you to imagine for a moment what that must have felt like from Peleus's side of things. He was a mortal man going about his life, and suddenly he learns that the gods themselves have decided he is to marry a sea goddess. The stories say he had to wrestle her first, there on the beach, because Thetis did not want a mortal husband and could shift her shape at will to escape him, turning into fire, then water, then a lion, then a serpent, trying every trick to slip out of his grasp. But Peleus, following advice given to him by an old prophet, held on through every transformation until she finally gave up and agreed to become his wife. It is a strange courtship by any modern measure, and it tells you something important about how the Greeks understood their own myths. These were not simple love stories. They were stories about power, fate, and the uneasy space where the divine and the human world touched each other, sometimes gently, sometimes with real violence. Their wedding, when it finally happened, is one of the most famous weddings in all of Greek mythology, not because of what happened during the ceremony, but because of what happened afterward. Nearly every god and goddess was invited to celebrate on Mount Pelion, a mountain overlooking the sea in Thessaly. Wine was poured, music played, and the immortals gathered to honor the strange union of a mortal king and a sea nymph. But one goddess was left off the guest list: Eris, the goddess of discord and strife. Whether this was an oversight or a deliberate insult, the stories disagree, but Eris was furious at being excluded, and she showed up anyway, uninvited, carrying a single golden apple inscribed with the words for the fairest. She rolled it into the crowd of goddesses and left. 3 goddesses immediately claimed the apple was meant for them: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Their argument over who deserved the title of fairest eventually led to the judgment of Paris, a young Trojan prince asked to settle the dispute, who chose Aphrodite after she promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. That woman was Helen, already married to a Greek king named Menelaus. And that choice, made at a wedding feast years before Achilles was even born, is the spark that would eventually ignite the Trojan War. So even before our hero draws his first breath, we can already see the whole tragedy of his life beginning to take shape, quietly, in the background, the way a storm gathers on the horizon long before the first drop of rain falls. Let's slow down and picture the birth itself. Imagine the palace at Phthia, a modest stone building by Mediterranean standards, built low against the wind that came down off the mountains, with thick walls to keep out both the cold in winter and the heat in summer. There would have been a central hearth room, smoke curling up through a hole in the roof, the smell of wood smoke mixing with roasting meat and herbs. Oil lamps, small clay dishes filled with olive oil and a floating wick, would have flickered in the corners, casting long, moving shadows against the walls. Outside, the Aegean Sea stretched out gray and endless, the same sea that Thetis herself had come from. When the baby was born, Thetis, according to the old stories, was consumed by a single desperate wish: to make her son immortal. She could not bear the thought that her child, half divine as he was, would still be subject to the same fate as every other mortal: a short life followed by nothing but shadow and dust in the underworld. Different versions of the myth describe different methods she tried. In one version, she held the infant by the heel and dipped him into the river Styx, the river that separated the world of the living from the world of the dead, its waters said to grant invulnerability to anyone who touched them. Every part of his body that touched the water became impossible to wound, every part except the heel by which she held him, which never touched the river at all, and which remained the one place on his entire body where he could still be harmed. In another, older version of the story, Thetis anointed the infant with ambrosia, the food of the gods, during the day, and at night she would hold him over the hearth fire, burning away his mortal flesh piece by piece to make him immortal, the way you might slowly temper metal in a forge. Peleus, walking in one night and seeing his infant son held over the flames, panicked and cried out, interrupting the ritual before it could be completed. And in some tellings this interruption is the reason Achilles never achieved true immortality at all. Both versions tell us the same essential thing about Thetis as a mother. She loved her son so completely, and feared his mortality so deeply, that she was willing to do something strange, even frightening, to protect him. It is worth pausing here, just for a moment, to think about how universal that particular fear is. Long before anyone worried about illness or accident in the way we do now, with hospitals and medicine and the long lifespans we take for granted, A mother in the ancient world lived with the knowledge that childhood itself was dangerous, that death could come easily and early, and that there was very little she could do to stop it. Thetis, a goddess with power over the sea itself, still could not simply will her son into safety. She had to bargain, to ritualize, to try every trick available to her. And in the end, it was not enough. There was still one small, unprotected place on her son's body, and it is that single vulnerable heel that history has remembered above almost everything else about him. More than his victories, more than his rage, more than his grief. We remember the one place he could be hurt. I think there is something quietly moving in that. Even the greatest warrior who ever lived, blessed by a goddess mother, trained by legendary teachers, gifted with speed and strength beyond any other man, still carried inside him one small point of ordinary human fragility. Perhaps that is why his story has lasted so long. He was not simply a god pretending to be a man. He was something in between, magnificent in almost every way, and yet still, in the end, breakable. Let's move forward now and follow young Achilles up into the mountains, to the strange and gentle teacher who would shape him more than anyone else. The mountain and the centaur, by the time Achilles was old enough to walk and speak, his parents' marriage had already begun to unravel. Thetis, still grieving the failure of her attempts to make her son fully immortal, and perhaps resentful of the mortal life she had been forced into, eventually left Peleus and returned to the sea, to live among her sisters, the other daughters of Nereus, in their underwater halls. Peleus was left alone to raise his son, a mortal father raising a half-divine child, and he made a decision that would shape the rest of Achilles' life. He sent the boy away to be raised by a centaur. I want you to sit with that idea for a moment, because it tells you something important about how differently the Greeks thought about childhood and education compared to how we think about it now. There was no sense that a child needed to be kept close, sheltered, protected in a soft and comfortable home for as long as possible. Among the Greek aristocracy, it was common, even expected, for young boys destined for greatness to be sent away from their families to be trained by someone with special knowledge, someone who could teach them the skills a king or a hero would need. And there was no teacher more famous in all of Greek myth than the centaur Charon. Charon was unlike other centaurs. Most centaurs in Greek mythology were wild, half-horse, half-man creatures known for their drunkenness, their lack of self-control, their violence at feasts. But Charon was different, wise, gentle, deeply learned in medicine, music, hunting, and the stars. He lived on Mount Pelion, the same mountain where Peleus and Thetis had held their wedding, in a cave among the pine forests, and over the years he trained many of the great heroes of Greek myth, including Jason, who would later lead the Argonauts, and the healer Asclepius, who would become the god of medicine. Now it was Achilles' turn. Let's go inside that cave for a moment and imagine what daily life might have looked like for a young boy being raised there. Picture waking before dawn in the cool mountain air, the pine forest still dark around you, the only sound the distant call of birds beginning to stir. Charon would have woken his young student early, because there was much to learn, and the days were not long enough for laziness. The morning might have started with a long run through the forest trails, Achilles' bare feet growing tougher and quicker with every passing month, learning to move silently over roots and stones, to read the terrain ahead without slowing down. This was not exercise for its own sake. In a world without modern medicine, without reliable food supplies, without any guarantee of safety, physical toughness was survival. A boy who could run fast, who could react quickly, who understood his own body completely, had an enormous advantage in a world where danger could come from a hostile neighboring town, a wild animal, or simple hunger during a hard winter. After the run, there might have been hunting lessons, learning to track deer and wild boar through the underbrush, to read broken twigs and disturbed leaves, to understand the wind and how it carried scent, so that the animals being hunted would not catch the hunter's smell before he was ready to strike. Charon is said to have taught Achilles to hunt lions, an almost unimaginable task for a young boy, but the old stories describe him bringing down his first lion while still just a child, an early sign of the extraordinary physical gifts he had inherited from his divine mother. But it would be a mistake to imagine Achilles' education on the mountain as nothing but physical training. Charon was also known as a healer, one of the great medical teachers of Greek myth, and he taught his young student the properties of herbs and plants, how certain roots could stop bleeding, how others could ease pain, how a wound should be cleaned and wrapped to prevent infection. This detail matters more than it might seem at first. Later in his life, on the battlefield outside Troy, Achilles is remembered not only as a fighter, but also as someone with real medical knowledge, capable of treating wounded comrades, a skill directly traced back to these quiet lessons in a cave on Mount Pelion, learning the names and uses of plants most people walked past without a second glance. There was music, too. Charon taught Achilles to play the lyre, a small stringed instrument, and in the evenings, after the hunting and running and lessons in medicine were finished, the young boy might have sat by a small fire inside the cave, practicing simple melodies, learning the old songs that told the stories of heroes who had come before him. It is worth pausing here to imagine that scene fully. A young boy, gifted with unimaginable physical strength, sitting quietly by firelight, carefully plucking the strings of a lyre, his fingers still learning the careful, patient work of making music. It is such a different image than the one most people carry of Achilles, the raging warrior on the battlefield, and yet both images are part of the same person. Later in the story, when Achilles is grown and camped outside the walls of Troy, furious and refusing to fight, the great epic poem that tells his story describes him sitting in his tent, playing a lyre, singing of the deeds of ancient heroes. It is a small, quiet detail, easy to miss, but it connects all the way back to these evenings with Charon on the mountain, and it reminds us that even the fiercest warrior in the ancient world found comfort in music, the same way any tired person might, then or now, reaching for something gentle at the end of a hard day. Imagine, too, the simplicity of meals up on that mountain. There would have been no grand feasts, no roasted whole animals carved before a crowd. More likely, Achilles ate what any hunter's apprentice ate in that period: roasted meat from the day's hunt, wild greens and herbs gathered along the trails, perhaps bread if grain could be traded for or carried up from the valley below, and water from the cold mountain streams that ran down off Pelion slopes. There is a particular detail preserved in some ancient sources that Charon fed young Achilles the innards of lions and wild boars, along with the marrow of bears, believing that this diet would pass on the courage and strength of these animals to the boy who ate them. Whether or not this reflects any real ancient practice, or is simply a poetic way of explaining Achilles' later ferocity, it gives us a vivid, almost primal image of what his upbringing might have felt like. A childhood built entirely around strength, endurance, and closeness to the wild world, so different from the soft palace life his father might otherwise have given him. Let's take a moment here to consider how strange and how different this all is from anything most of us experienced growing up. No school with other children his own age. No mother tucking him into bed at night, since Thetis had returned to the sea. No father close by to guide his daily habits, since Peleus remained down in Phthia, ruling his kingdom. Just a wise old centaur, a mountain, a cave, and years of quiet, demanding lessons meant to shape a boy into the greatest warrior the world would ever know. There is something almost lonely in that image, and yet also something deeply peaceful, a childhood spent close to nature, far from the noise and politics of the human world below, learning at the feet of a patient and unusually gentle teacher. It was on this mountain, too, according to some versions of the myth, that Achilles received his name. Some ancient writers claim his birth name was actually Ligeron, and that Charon renamed him Achilles, meaning something close to grief of the people, or he who brings distress to the army, a name that would prove painfully accurate, foreshadowing both the grief he would cause his enemies in battle, and in a quieter, sadder sense, the grief his own stubborn pride would eventually bring upon his own comrades. Whatever the truth of the name, by the time Achilles came down from that mountain, no longer a small boy but a young man on the edge of adulthood, he was already something extraordinary, faster than any other person alive, trained in both violence and healing, comfortable with music as well as war, and entirely unaware, as young people so often are, of just how short and dramatic the rest of his life was about to become. Let's follow him now to the next chapter of his story, one that history remembers far less often, but which reveals a softer, stranger, more human side of the great warrior than almost anything else in his tale. Hidden among the daughters of Skyros before the Trojan War ever began, there was a prophecy, one of many that circle around Achilles' life like smoke around a fire, never quite settling, always shifting shape depending on who was telling the story. This particular prophecy said that Troy could not be taken without Achilles fighting in the war, but also that if Achilles went to Troy, he would die there, young, far from home, his name remembered forever but his life cut painfully short. If he stayed home instead, he would live a long, quiet, unremarkable life and eventually be forgotten. Thetis, his mother, upon hearing this prophecy, made a decision that many mothers throughout history might understand, even if the method she chose was unusual. She decided to hide her son, to keep him away from the war entirely, hoping that if he was never found, he could never be called upon to fight, and could live out his natural life in safety. So she took him to the island of Skyros, a small, rocky island in the Aegean Sea, and brought him to the court of King Lycomedes. There, in one of the strangest episodes in the entire story of Achilles, she disguised her son as a girl, dressing him in the robes and jewelry of the royal daughters, and hid him among the king's own daughters in the women's quarters of the palace. I want you to really sit with this scene for a moment, because it is unlike almost anything else in Greek myth involving a great hero. Imagine the private rooms of a Bronze Age palace, quieter and more enclosed than the public halls where the king received guests and held feasts. These would have been rooms filled with the daily rhythms of women's work in that period, weaving at tall wooden looms, the rhythmic clack of the shuttle passing back and forth through the threads, baskets of wool waiting to be spun into yarn, the soft murmur of conversation and occasional laughter as the daughters of the household worked side by side. There would have been oil lamps burning low in the evenings, the smell of perfumed oils and herbs used for grooming, jewelry of bronze and gold laid out on small tables, robes dyed in soft colors from local plants. And somewhere among all of this, disguised under the name Pyrrha, meaning the red-haired one, was Achilles, the future greatest warrior of the age, learning to weave, to move quietly among the other girls, to hide the very things that made him who he was. According to the myths, he did not simply sit passively through this disguise. During his time on Skyros, he fell into a relationship with one of Lycomedes's daughters, a young woman named Deidamia, and the two of them had a son together, Neoptolemus, who would himself grow up to play a role in the final days of the Trojan War, years after his father's death. This detail alone tells us that whatever else Achilles was hiding, his physical vitality and his youthful passions could not be so easily disguised by a simple change of clothes. Word eventually reached the Greek leaders gathering their forces for war against Troy that Achilles, prophesied to be essential for victory, was hidden somewhere among the royal households of the Aegean islands. The Greek commanders sent a clever man to find him, Odysseus, king of Ithaca, already known even at this early stage for his sharp intelligence and his gift for solving problems that brute force alone could not. Odysseus arrived at the court of Lycomedes disguised as a traveling merchant, and he devised a simple but brilliant test. He laid out a collection of goods for the young women of the palace to examine: fine cloth, jewelry, perfumes, delicate ornaments, the kinds of things any young noblewoman of the time would naturally be drawn to. But hidden among these items, he placed a sword and a shield. While the daughters of Lycomedes gathered eagerly around the jewelry and fabrics, admiring the fine craftsmanship and holding pieces up to see how they caught the light, one of the girls reached instead for the sword, lifting it, testing its weight and balance with an instinct that no amount of disguise could hide. In some versions of the story, Odysseus added another trick to be certain. He arranged for a sudden, loud trumpet blast outside, the sound of an alarm suggesting an attack was underway. While the other young women startled and reached for shelter, Achilles instinctively grabbed the weapon and moved toward the door, ready to fight, his training on Mount Pelion surfacing in an instant, overriding years of careful disguise in a single heartbeat of instinct. His identity revealed, Achilles had to choose. Stay hidden, live a long, quiet, forgettable life on Skyros, perhaps eventually inheriting some measure of status through his son, or reveal himself fully, join the Greek expedition against Troy, and step into the fate that had been laid out for him since before his birth, glory bought at the price of an early death. He chose Troy. It is worth pausing here in the quiet space of the story to think about what that choice really meant. Achilles was still very young, likely somewhere in his late teens by most tellings, a young man who had just fathered a child, who had spent months living among women, learning gentler, quieter skills far from the battlefield. And now, in a single afternoon, all of that fell away and he chose war and the fame that would come from it over a long, safe, unremarkable life. Whether this reflects the values of the Greek warrior culture that shaped these myths, where honor and lasting memory mattered more than mere survival, or whether it reflects something restless and specific to Achilles' own character, is something the old poets leave for us to wonder about ourselves. His mother's careful plan, born entirely out of love and fear for her son's safety, had failed. And so the next chapter of Achilles' life would take him not to a quiet palace or a peaceful mountain, but down to the busy, crowded harbor of Aulis, where hundreds of Greek ships were gathering, preparing to sail across the sea toward the high walls of Troy. Let's follow him there now, to the noisy, restless days before the war truly began. The gathering at Aulis before we step onto the beach at Aulis. It helps to understand, slowly and without rushing, why this war was happening at all, because the causes of the Trojan War tell us as much about the Bronze Age Greek world as any battle ever could. You will remember the golden apple from the wedding feast of Peleus and Thetis, tossed carelessly into the crowd by an uninvited goddess of discord, and the argument it caused between three goddesses over who was the fairest. That argument was eventually settled, or rather, made much worse by a young Trojan prince named Paris, who was asked to judge the contest. Each goddess offered him a bribe. Hera offered political power, Athena offered wisdom and victory in battle, and Aphrodite offered him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, still young and perhaps not thinking as carefully as he should have, chose Aphrodite's gift. The most beautiful woman in the world happened to already be married. Her name was Helen, and she was the wife of a Greek king named Menelaus, ruler of Sparta. With Aphrodite's help, Paris traveled to Sparta as a guest, was welcomed warmly into Menelaus's household according to the deep customs of hospitality that governed relationships between guests and hosts in the ancient world. And then, while his host was away, either persuaded Helen to leave with him willingly or took her by force, depending on which ancient source you read. He sailed back to Troy with her, along with a portion of Menelaus's household treasure. For the Greeks, this was not simply a personal betrayal between two men over a woman. It was a violation of one of the deepest, most sacred social codes in their entire culture, the bond of hospitality between guest and host, a relationship believed to be protected by Zeus himself. To violate it so completely, to repay a host's welcome by stealing his wife, was seen as an offense against the gods, not just against Menelaus personally. Menelaus turned to his brother, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and the most powerful ruler among the Greek kingdoms, and together they called upon the other Greek kings and warlords to honor an old oath. Years earlier, when Helen was still unmarried and courted by nearly every eligible king in Greece, her father had required all of her suitors to swear an oath that whoever she chose to marry, all the others would come to his aid if anyone ever tried to take her away by force. It was a clever way of avoiding war among the suitors themselves, but it meant that when Paris took Helen to Troy, nearly every major Greek kingdom was bound by sacred oath to join the effort to bring her back. And so, over many months, ships and soldiers gathered from across the Greek world, converging on a harbor called Achilles on the eastern coast of central Greece, a natural gathering point where the winds and currents made it possible to organize a fleet before setting out across the open water toward Troy, far away on the coast of what is now northwestern Turkey. Let's go inside that gathering for a while and imagine what it might have actually looked like and felt like, day to day, in the weeks before the fleet finally set sail. Picture a wide, curving beach, backed by low hills covered in olive trees and scrub brush, the kind of landscape common across much of Greece. Now imagine that beach crowded edge to edge with ships. Not the massive wooden warships of later centuries, but Bronze Age vessels, long and narrow, built from planks of pine and oak, with a single square sail and rows of oars along each side, capable of carrying anywhere from 20 to 50 men, along with their weapons, armor, and supplies. According to the old epic poems, well over 1,000 ships gathered at Achilles, though modern historians generally agree that number was exaggerated for poetic effect, meant to convey the overwhelming scale of the expedition rather than an exact historical count. Still, even a fraction of that number would have created an extraordinary scene. Imagine the noise alone. Hammers striking wood as final repairs were made to hulls, the creak of ropes being tightened, shouted orders passed between officers organizing the loading of supplies, the constant murmur of thousands of soldiers, sailors, and camp followers moving along the beach. Smoke would have risen from countless cooking fires, since an army that size needed to be fed every single day, and cooking on that scale, without any of the conveniences we take for granted, was a massive, constant undertaking. Bread would have been baked in simple clay ovens dug into the sand, fish caught fresh from the surrounding waters, and meat, when available, roasted over open fires, the smell of wood smoke and cooking food drifting out over the water and mixing with the salt air. Imagine the soldiers themselves, most of them farmers and herders back home rather than professional fighters, many of them likely nervous, some excited, others quietly dreading the long separation from their families that lay ahead. There would have been young men experiencing their first time away from home, older men who had fought in smaller conflicts before and understood better what war actually demanded, and everywhere the particular restlessness of a large group of people waiting for something to begin, filling the time with games of dice, wrestling matches on the sand to pass the hours, arguments over sleeping space and supplies, and long evenings around the fire swapping stories, some true, many exaggerated, about the battles and adventures that lay ahead. It was here, at Achilles, that Achilles arrived, no longer disguised as a girl on a quiet island, but now dressed as a warrior, bringing with him a contingent of soldiers from his home region of Phthia, men known as the Myrmidons. The name Myrmidon is connected, in myth, to an old story about ants transformed into men by the god Zeus, and whether or not there is any truth buried in that legend, the name came to represent something specific in the Greek imagination. soldiers known for their discipline, their loyalty, and their tireless, almost mechanical dedication to their leader. Wherever Achilles went, the Myrmidons followed, a tightly bound unit that would remain fiercely loyal to him throughout the entire war, even during the periods when Achilles himself refused to fight. The gathering at Achilles was not without its own dramatic complications, however, and one story in particular is worth pausing over, because it directly involves Achilles, even though he plays only a small, almost unwilling part in it. According to the myths, the Greek fleet found itself unable to sail from Aulis because the wind simply would not cooperate, day after day, week after week. Eventually it was revealed through the prophet Calchas that the goddess Artemis was angry with Agamemnon, the commander of the entire expedition, for some offense against her, and that the only way to appease her and secure favorable winds was for Agamemnon to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. To lure Iphigenia to Aulis without revealing the terrible truth of what awaited her, Agamemnon sent word to his wife, Clytemnestra, claiming that their daughter was being brought there to be married to Achilles, the great young hero everyone was already speaking of. It was, in the darkest possible sense, a lie built on the borrowed reputation of a young man who had no idea his name was even being used this way. Different versions of the myth handle the ending of this story differently. In some, the sacrifice of Iphigenia is carried out fully, a grim and sobering reminder of how ancient warfare was often tied closely to religious belief, where victory was thought to depend on the correct appeasement of the gods, sometimes at a devastating personal cost. In other versions, at the very last moment, Artemis takes pity on the girl and secretly substitutes a deer in her place, sweeping Iphigenia away to become a priestess in a distant land, sparing her life while still allowing her father to believe the sacrifice had been completed. Either way, the winds finally shifted, and the fleet was able to set sail. It is a dark story to sit with, and it tells us something important about the world Achilles was stepping into. This was not simply a straightforward tale of heroes marching off to a righteous war. From its very beginning, at the harbor of Aulis before a single ship had even left the shore, the expedition to Troy was already tangled up with deception, painful sacrifice, and the uneasy relationship between mortal ambition and divine will. Achilles, still young, still perhaps more comfortable with the quiet lessons of Charon's mountain than with the politics of kings, found his own name and reputation used as bait in a plot he had no part in creating. Let's take a slow breath here before we move on. It's worth remembering, every so often in a story like this, just how different this ancient world truly was from our own. A world where the wind itself was thought to be controlled by the moods of the gods, where a father might believe it necessary to sacrifice his own daughter to continue a military campaign, where a teenager's name could be attached to a wedding that was never actually going to happen. And yet within all of that strangeness, there are threads of something deeply familiar too. Nervous young soldiers far from home for the first time, families torn apart by distant wars, leaders making difficult, sometimes terrible choices under pressure, and the simple, universal human experience of waiting, restless and uncertain, for a long journey to finally begin. With the winds finally favorable, the great fleet at last pushed off from the beach at Achilles, oars dipping into the water in steady rhythm, sails catching the wind, and turned east, toward the distant coast of Troy, and toward the war that would occupy the next 10 years of Achilles' short life. Let's follow those ships now, out across the wine-dark waters of the Aegean, toward the beach that would become Achilles' home for a decade. A city on the horizon, the journey from Achilles to Troy was not, by most accounts, quick or simple. Ancient sailing depended entirely on wind and weather, and a fleet of that size, made up of many independent ships crewed by soldiers rather than professional sailors, would have moved slowly, hugging coastlines where possible, stopping frequently at islands and harbors along the way to take on fresh water, food, and rest. I want you to imagine those days at sea, because they would have made up a significant portion of the early experience of this war, long before any fighting actually began. Picture the gentle, constant motion of an open wooden boat on the water, the creak of timber, the rhythmic splash of oars when the wind died down and the rowers had to take over, the salt spray occasionally catching your face if you leaned too far over the side. Nights would have been spent either at anchor near some sheltered cove, the ships pulled up onto whatever beach could be found, small fires lit for cooking, men sleeping under simple cloaks beneath the open sky, the stars overhead brighter and clearer than most of us ever see them today, free from any artificial light for hundreds of miles in every direction. There would have been long stretches of boredom too, hours and days where nothing happened at all except the slow movement of the ship across calm water, men passing the time with quiet conversation, games, songs, or simply staring out at the endless horizon, watching for the first sign of land. For a young man like Achilles, so recently pulled away from the disguised, gentle life on Skyros and thrust suddenly into the role of a great warrior leading his own contingent of soldiers, these quiet days at sea might have felt like a strange, suspended moment between two entirely different lives, the last calm breath before 10 years of war. Eventually, the coastline of Asia Minor would have come into view, low hills rising from the sea, and somewhere among them, the city of Troy itself, sitting on a low rise of land near the mouth of two rivers, the Scamander and the Simwa, close enough to the sea to be a major trading power, but positioned just far enough inland to be difficult to attack directly from the water. Now, it's worth pausing here to talk honestly about what we actually know, historically, about Troy itself, because this is a point where the poetic myth and the archaeological record intersect in a genuinely fascinating way. For a very long time, many scholars believed that Troy was purely a legendary city, a poetic invention with no real historical basis at all. That changed in the 19th century, when a wealthy and controversial amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann, guided largely by his close reading of the ancient poems, excavated a site called Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey and found the remains of an actual ancient city, one that had been built and rebuilt many times over thousands of years, with distinct layers corresponding to different periods of habitation, and in some layers, evidence of violent destruction. Modern archaeologists have continued that work in the years since, and the general scholarly consensus today is that there was very likely a real city at that location, an important trading center during the late Bronze Age, and quite possibly a real conflict, or series of conflicts, between this city and Greek forces sometime around the 1200s BCE. Whether that historical conflict resembled the 10-year siege described in the poems, whether it involved a single dramatic war rather than a longer, messier series of raids and skirmishes typical of the period, and whether any of the specific individuals in the story, including Achilles himself, were based on real historical figures, remains genuinely uncertain, and honest historians are careful to acknowledge that uncertainty rather than presenting the myth as settled fact. What we can say with more confidence is that the world described in the poems, the armor, the weapons, the burial customs, the style of warfare involving chariots and hand-to-hand combat with bronze weapons, does reflect real elements of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean world, even if the specific story of Achilles and the fall of Troy is a work of poetic imagination built loosely around a kernel of historical memory. Passed down through generations of oral storytelling long before it was ever written down in the form we know today, primarily through the epic poem called the Iliad, traditionally attributed to a poet named Homer, though even his exact identity and historical existence remains debated among scholars. I share all of that not to undercut the emotional power of the story, but because I think it actually makes the story more interesting, not less. We are not simply listening to a fairy tale with no connection to real human experience. We are listening to a story that likely grew, slowly, over centuries, out of real memories of real conflicts, real cities, real soldiers who sailed across real seas to fight and die on a real coastline. All of it gradually shaped and reshaped by generations of storytellers into the version we still tell today. With that context settled quietly in the background, let's return to our young hero, arriving at last on the shores near Troy, stepping off the ship onto a beach that would become, for the next 10 years, something closer to home than any palace or mountain cave he had known before. Life on the beach at Troy here is something that often surprises people when they first slow down and really think about the Trojan War. For the vast majority of those 10 long years, according to the traditional story, there was no siege in the way we usually picture a siege. No constant daily fighting, no unbroken years of battle. Instead, the Greek forces were camped on the beach near Troy, in a kind of long, uneasy standoff, launching occasional raids and skirmishes, sometimes going for extended periods with no major fighting at all, essentially living an entire decade of ordinary daily life, just relocated to a foreign beach, far from their homes and families. Let's go inside that camp for a while, because this is where so much of the real texture of Achilles' life, and the lives of the thousands of ordinary men who fought alongside him, actually took place. Imagine a long stretch of sandy shoreline, the ships pulled up out of the water and arranged in rows, their hulls providing some shelter from the wind. Around and behind these ships, a sprawling camp would have grown over the years, tents and simple shelters built from wood, cloth, and whatever materials could be gathered or brought from home, organized loosely by which contingent of soldiers each group belonged to. Achilles and his myrmidons would have had their own section of the camp, their ships pulled up together, their own cooking fires, their own particular routines and habits, distinct from the camps of other kings and their soldiers nearby. Daily life in a camp like this would have revolved around a set of basic, repeating tasks that most history books skip right past on their way to the famous battles, but which actually made up the overwhelming majority of the lived experience of this war. Food had to be gathered and prepared constantly. Soldiers would have gone out in smaller groups to hunt, fish, and forage in the surrounding countryside when supplies ran low, and raids on nearby towns and villages, sometimes described in the old poems almost casually, were a regular part of sustaining an army of this size over such a long period, a detail that reminds us how much ordinary hardship and how much suffering inflicted on people far from the main conflict lay beneath the more glorified parts of this story. Water needed to be carried from nearby streams or wells. Firewood had to be gathered daily for cooking and warmth, especially as the seasons changed and the sea winds turned cold in winter. Weapons and armor required constant maintenance, since bronze could be damaged or dulled with use, and a soldier's life might depend on a blade being properly sharpened or a shield strap being securely fastened. Clothing wore out and needed mending, sandals needed replacing, and small personal tasks like this would have filled countless quiet hours throughout each long day. I want you to imagine for a moment an ordinary evening in that camp, away from any of the famous, dramatic scenes described in the epic poems. Picture the sun beginning to set over the water, the light turning soft and golden, then fading into a deep blue twilight. Cooking fires would be lit throughout the camp, small groups of men gathered around each one. The smell of roasting meat or simmering grain mixing with wood smoke, and the salty, mineral scent of the nearby sea. Someone might be repairing a sandal strap by the firelight, another sharpening a spear point with slow, careful strokes of a whetstone, the soft, rhythmic scraping sound blending with quiet conversation, and somewhere further off, perhaps the sound of someone singing an old song from home, or playing a simple melody on a reed pipe or a lyre. Achilles himself, according to the Iliad, was known to spend some of these evenings exactly this way, sitting outside or inside his tent, playing a lyre that had actually been taken as spoils from a raided city, singing songs about the great deeds of heroes who had come before him, the same kind of songs Charon had likely taught him back on Mount Pelion. It is worth sitting with that image slowly, because it shows us something important about how the Greeks understood heroism itself. It was not simply about physical violence and conquest. A hero was also expected to appreciate music, poetry, and the preservation of memory, understanding that one day songs would be sung about his own deeds too, the same way he now sang about the heroes who came before him. His closest companion throughout these long years was a man named Patroclus, and it is impossible to tell the story of Achilles honestly without spending real time on this relationship, because it sits at the emotional center of everything that happens later in the war. Patroclus had grown up alongside Achilles from childhood, sent to the court of Peleus as a young boy after being exiled from his own homeland following an accidental killing during a childhood game, a common enough situation in the ancient world. where a young man from a good family who had caused an accidental death might be sent away to live under the protection of another noble household, rather than face blood vengeance from his victim's family. Peleus took him in, and the two boys grew up together, trained together, and by the time they arrived at Troy as grown men, their bond had deepened into something the ancient sources describe with real emotional intensity, closer and more devoted than almost any other relationship in the entire poem. The exact nature of their relationship, whether it should be understood primarily as an intensely close friendship in the particular cultural context of ancient Greek warrior culture, or as something we would today more clearly identify as a romantic and physical relationship between the two men, has been debated by scholars and readers for centuries. And honestly, different ancient Greek writers themselves seem to interpret it differently depending on the period and the author. What remains consistent across nearly every version of the story is the sheer depth of devotion between them, a bond so central to Achilles' own sense of identity and purpose that its eventual, violent ending becomes the true turning point of his entire story, more than any battle, more than any duel. Let's imagine for a moment what an ordinary day shared between the two of them might have looked like during these quieter years of the war, since the poems themselves give us small, gentle glimpses of this alongside all the larger battle scenes. There might have been mornings spent training together on the beach, practicing spear throws and hand-to-hand combat drills, the sand shifting under their feet, sweat cooling quickly in the sea breeze. There would have been meals shared together, sitting close by the fire, talking through the events of the day, discussing news brought back by scouts or messengers from other parts of the camp, or simply sitting in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have known each other for a very long time. In the evenings, while Achilles played his lyre, Patroclus is described in the poem as sitting nearby, waiting quietly for his turn to sing, the two of them passing an ordinary evening together in a way that feels, even after 3,000 years, remarkably tender and human. It's worth taking a slow moment here to think about how different a soldier's daily emotional life during this war might have been from what we often imagine when we picture ancient warfare. Yes, there was violence, and there would be more of it as the years passed. But there was also this: quiet evenings, shared meals, music, friendship, small acts of care between men who depended on each other completely, not just for physical protection in battle, but for the ordinary emotional support that any person needs to endure years away from home, in a foreign land, uncertain if they would ever return. As the years passed, the war settled into this long, uneven rhythm. Periods of raiding nearby towns for supplies and plunder, occasional larger confrontations with Trojan forces, long stretches of relative calm where daily camp life continued much as I've described, and always in the background, the slow passage of time, seasons changing, letters and news occasionally arriving from home, soldiers growing older, some falling sick or dying from illness or injury far from any battlefield glory, the ordinary attrition of a very long war that gets compressed, in most retellings, into a handful of dramatic events, but which in reality was made up of thousands upon thousands of ordinary days, just like the ones we've been imagining together. It was during one of these raids, deep into the 9th year of the war, that the true turning point of Achilles' entire story finally began to take shape, not on the battlefield against Troy itself, but in a bitter dispute between Achilles and the commander of the entire Greek army, a dispute over pride, honor, and a captured woman that would nearly cost the Greeks the entire war. Let's move into that story slowly now. The quarrel that begins the Iliad. To understand what happens next, it helps to understand one particular custom of warfare in this period that can feel deeply uncomfortable to modern ears, but which was simply an accepted part of how conflicts were conducted at the time. When Greek forces raided nearby towns and villages allied with Troy, or captured settlements during the long course of the war, it was common practice for captured women to be distributed among the leading warriors as a form of battle prize, alongside other plunder like livestock, metal goods, and treasure. This was considered an honor, a tangible symbol of a warrior's status and success, and the women themselves, stripped of their homes, families, and freedom, were treated as part of this system of reward and status among the Greek commanders. I mention this plainly, without softening it, because it matters for understanding what happens next, and because pretending this aspect of the ancient world didn't exist would do a disservice to the real history, and to the real women whose suffering is often reduced, in the ancient poems themselves, to little more than a plot device in a dispute between powerful men. During one such raid, Agamemnon, the overall commander of the Greek forces, had received a woman named Chrysis as his prize, the daughter of a priest of Apollo named Chryses. When Chryses came to the Greek camp to beg for his daughter's return, offering a generous ransom, Agamemnon refused, harshly dismissing the old priest and sending him away. Chryses, devastated, prayed to Apollo for justice, and Apollo answered by sending a plague down upon the Greek camp, arrows of sickness raining down invisibly among the soldiers, killing men and animals alike over the course of 9 terrible days. It's worth pausing to imagine what those 9 days must have actually felt like, living through them in that camp on the beach, because plague in the ancient world was a horror almost impossible for us to fully appreciate today. With no understanding of germs or infection, no real medical explanation available beyond divine anger, and no way to predict who would fall sick next or how many more would die before it ended. Imagine waking each morning uncertain whether you yourself might be the next to fall ill, watching friends and comrades sicken and die with no way to help them beyond whatever herbal remedies and prayers were available, the funeral pyres burning day and night along the beach, the smoke rising in an unbroken column, the entire camp gripped by a quiet, creeping fear that no army, however strong, could fight back against an enemy they couldn't even see. Eventually, on the 10th day, Achilles called an assembly of the Greek leaders and asked the prophet Calchas to explain why the gods had turned against them. Calchas, protected by Achilles' promise of safety, revealed that Apollo's anger stemmed directly from Agamemnon's mistreatment of the priest Chryses, and that the plague would only end if Chrysis was returned to her father without ransom, along with a formal sacrifice to appease the god. Agamemnon, furious and deeply wounded in his pride at being publicly blamed for the suffering of the entire army, agreed to give up Chryses, but declared that if he had to lose his prize, he would take another warrior's prize in compensation, to avoid the humiliation of appearing weaker than the other commanders. He chose Briseis, a woman who had been given to Achilles as his own battle prize after an earlier raid. This is the spark that ignites the central conflict of the entire Iliad, and it's worth being honest and clear about what this dispute actually was and wasn't about. On the surface, it can look almost petty to modern readers, a fight between two powerful men over the ownership of a woman, but underneath that surface, the conflict was really about something the ancient Greek warrior culture considered enormously significant: honor, public status, and the fair distribution of glory and reward among the leaders of the army. For Achilles, having his prize publicly seized by Agamemnon was not simply the loss of an individual woman, though that mattered too, but a profound public humiliation, a signal that his contributions and sacrifices to the war effort could be casually disregarded by the man in overall command, undermining the entire system of honor and reputation that gave a warrior's dangerous life its meaning in the first place. Achilles' response was immediate and severe. In a scene of raw, unfiltered anger that opens the entire Iliad, he confronted Agamemnon in front of the assembled army, calling him shameless and greedy, questioning why the Greeks were even fighting this war in the first place if their own commander showed such little respect for the men risking their lives under him. The argument grew heated enough that Achilles nearly drew his sword to kill Agamemnon on the spot, and the poem describes the goddess Athena appearing invisibly to hold him back, gripping him by the hair only he could feel, urging him toward words instead of violence. Achilles restrained himself from murder, but he did something almost as consequential in the context of this war. He announced that he and his myrmidons would withdraw entirely from the fighting. He would no longer lend his strength, his skill, or the loyalty of his men to a war effort led by a commander who had treated him with such open disrespect. Agamemnon, equally furious and unwilling to back down in front of the assembled army, followed through on his threat and had Briseis taken from Achilles' camp and brought to his own. Let's slow down here and really sit inside this moment, because it's easy to read past it quickly on the way to the more famous battle scenes that follow. But this quiet, bitter withdrawal is actually the true engine of the entire story. Imagine Achilles retreating to his section of the camp, watching Briseis led away by Agamemnon's heralds, the myrmidons around him uncertain and restless, unsure whether to feel loyal anger on their leader's behalf or quiet worry about what this withdrawal might mean for the war, and for their own eventual chances of returning home safely. According to the poem, Achilles went down alone to the edge of the sea that evening and wept, calling out to his mother Thetis, who rose up from the water to comfort him, the way she had comforted him as a child. It is a striking image, this legendary warrior, feared across two nations, sitting alone on a beach in tears, calling for his mother. And it reminds us again of something we touched on earlier in the story. However extraordinary Achilles' strength and skill were, he remained, underneath it all, a young man capable of deep hurt, deep loneliness, and a very human need for comfort in his darkest moments. Thetis, moved by her son's grief and anger, made a request of Zeus himself, king of the gods, asking him to grant the Trojans success in battle for as long as the Greeks continued fighting without Achilles, so that Agamemnon and the other Greek leaders would come to understand, through painful experience, just how much they truly needed him. Zeus agreed. And so began one of the most quietly devastating stretches of the entire war, not for the Trojans, who found themselves suddenly gaining real ground against the Greek forces, but for the Greeks themselves, who began to suffer heavy losses on the battlefield with their greatest warrior sitting idle in his tent, refusing every plea to return, even as his own countrymen died in growing numbers just a short distance away. Let's follow that painful stretch of the war now, and watch as the consequences of this quarrel begin to unfold. The war without Achilles, with Achilles and his Myrmidons withdrawn from battle, the balance of the war shifted noticeably in favor of Troy. The Trojan forces, led by their greatest warrior, Prince Hector, son of the Trojan king Priam, pressed their advantage with real skill and determination, driving the Greek forces back toward their own ships, threatening to burn the fleet entirely and strand the Greek army on a foreign shore with no way home. I want to spend some time here with Hector himself, because he deserves to be understood as more than simply an obstacle in Achilles' path. In many ways, the ancient poem treats Hector with as much sympathy and depth as it treats any Greek character, perhaps even more, and understanding him properly makes everything that happens later between him and Achilles far more meaningful. Hector was, by nearly every account in the poem, a devoted husband to his wife Andromache and a loving father to their infant son, Astyanax. Unlike many of the Greek warriors who had left their homes willingly to pursue plunder and glory in a foreign war, Hector was fighting to defend his own city, his own family, his own home, against a foreign invasion. There's a famous, quietly heartbreaking scene in the poem where Hector, taking a brief break from the fighting to visit his family within the walls of Troy, tries to hold his infant son, only for the boy to cry in fear at the sight of his father's bronze helmet with its tall horsehair crest. Hector, understanding immediately, removes the frightening helmet, sets it down, and takes his son in his arms bareheaded, laughing gently with his wife at the small, ordinary moment of parental tenderness, even as the war rages just outside the city walls. It's a small scene, easy to overlook, but it carries enormous weight, because it reminds us that this war, like every war throughout history, was fought by ordinary people with ordinary families, ordinary fears, and ordinary love for their children, regardless of which side of the conflict they happened to be fighting on. Hector was not a villain in this story. He was a decent man, a loving father trying desperately to protect his home from destruction, caught up in a conflict that had begun, in truth, through no fault of his own, but through his brother Paris's decision years earlier. With Achilles absent from the battlefield, Hector's forces pushed deep into Greek territory, fighting their way across the plain outside Troy and eventually reaching the Greek camp itself, setting fire to at least one of the beached ships, an enormous and terrifying development for the Greek forces, since their entire ability to eventually sail home depended on that fleet remaining intact. Desperate, the Greek commanders sent a formal delegation to Achilles' tent, hoping to persuade him to set aside his anger and rejoin the fighting before the entire war was lost. This delegation included Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca we met earlier, along with the aging warrior Phoenix, who had helped raise Achilles as a child, and the great warrior Ajax, one of the strongest fighters in the entire Greek army aside from Achilles himself. Let's go inside that tent for a moment and imagine the scene as it's described in the poem. Achilles receives his visitors not with hostility, but with genuine warmth and hospitality, in keeping with the deep customs of guest friendship that govern these interactions even amid personal conflict. He has them seated, offers them food and wine, prepared personally by Achilles and Patroclus together over the fire, a small human detail worth pausing on. Even in the midst of his anger and his refusal to fight, Achilles still observes the basic social rituals of care and hospitality toward guests in his tent, roasting meat and mixing wine with his own hands, rather than simply having servants attend to the visiting delegation. But when Odysseus makes his careful, diplomatic appeal, offering an enormous list of gifts and honors that Agamemnon has promised in exchange for Achilles' return to battle, including the return of Briseis along with additional treasure, Achilles refuses. His anger, it becomes clear in this scene, runs far deeper than simply wanting fair compensation. He speaks with real bitterness about the entire purpose of the war, questioning whether any amount of glory or treasure is truly worth risking his life for a conflict fought largely over Agamemnon's brother's stolen wife, and declaring, in one of the most striking passages in the whole poem, that no wealth in the world is worth more than a man's own life, since wealth can be regained but a life, once lost, is gone forever. It's worth sitting with that sentiment for a moment, because it represents something genuinely radical within the value system the poem otherwise seems to celebrate. This is a war built almost entirely around the pursuit of honor and glory, where reputation and remembrance after death are treated as the highest possible achievements a person can reach. And yet here, in this quiet tent scene, Achilles voices real doubt about whether that entire system of values is actually worth the cost it demands. He even mentions, briefly, the prophecy his mother told him long ago, that he faces a choice between a long, quiet, forgotten life at home or a short, glorious life remembered forever through death at Troy. And in this particular moment, sitting in his tent, freshly wounded by Agamemnon's disrespect, he seems genuinely uncertain which choice he actually wants to make. The delegation leaves without success. Achilles remains in his tent, and the war continues to go badly for the Greeks in his absence. Day after day, the fighting draws closer to the ships, the losses mount, and the desperation among the Greek forces deepens. Patroclus, watching all of this unfold from close beside his friend, grows increasingly distressed at the suffering of men he has fought alongside for years, men who are dying now in growing numbers while Achilles remains stubbornly apart from the battle. Eventually, Patroclus can bear it no longer. He goes to Achilles, weeping, and begs him either to rejoin the fighting himself, or, if his anger is still too deep to allow that, to at least let Patroclus wear Achilles' own armor and lead the Myrmidons into battle in his place, hoping that the mere sight of Achilles' distinctive armor might be enough to frighten the Trojan forces back from the ships, buying the Greeks enough time to recover. Achilles, moved by his friend's distress, and perhaps by his own quiet guilt at watching his countrymen suffer while he remains idle, agrees, but with a careful warning. Patroclus should drive the Trojans back from the ships and then return immediately, resisting the temptation to press the attack further toward the walls of Troy itself, where the danger would be far greater. Let's pause here, because this moment, this single decision, sets in motion the true tragedy at the very heart of Achilles' entire story, the loss that will transform him more completely than anything that came before it. The death of Patroclus. Patroclus dons Achilles' armor, distinctive and recognizable across the battlefield, and leads the Myrmidons out to rejoin the fighting. The effect is immediate and dramatic. The Trojan forces, seeing what they believe to be Achilles himself finally returning to battle after his long absence, are struck with fear and begin to fall back from the Greek ships, the tide of the entire war shifting within a matter of hours. Imagine that scene for a moment. The Trojan soldiers, exhausted from days of hard fighting, catching sight of that unmistakable armor gleaming in the sunlight, and feeling a fresh wave of dread wash over them, believing their greatest enemy has finally returned to face them. Patroclus, fighting with real skill and courage of his own, drives deep into the retreating Trojan lines, killing many soldiers, including Sarpedon, a son of Zeus himself, and one of Troy's important allied commanders, a death that causes even Zeus, watching from Olympus, to weep tears of blood in grief for his mortal son, unable to intervene directly to save him without disrupting the fate that governed all these events. But here is where Patroclus makes the fatal mistake that Achilles had specifically warned him against. Caught up in the momentum of his success, driving the Trojans back further and further, he pushes past the point of simply protecting the ships and presses the attack all the way toward the walls of Troy itself, even attempting, in a moment of overconfidence, to scale the city walls directly, an act the poem tells us was doomed from the start, since fate had decreed that Troy would not fall to Patroclus, wearing another man's armor on this particular day. The god Apollo himself intervenes at this critical moment, striking Patroclus from behind, stunning him and knocking Achilles' armor loose from his body. Wounded and suddenly vulnerable, Patroclus is then struck by a Trojan spear, and finally, in the chaos of the battlefield, killed by Hector himself, who finishes him off and strips Achilles' famous armor from his body as a battle trophy, an act that will carry enormous consequences of its own before this story is finished. Let's slow all the way down here, because everything about Achilles' character shifts permanently in this single moment, and it deserves to be treated with real care rather than rushed past on the way to the battle scenes that follow. Word of Patroclus's death reaches Achilles back at the camp, carried by a soldier named Antilochus, who finds Achilles waiting anxiously for news of the battle. The poem describes Achilles' reaction with an intensity that feels raw and immediate even after 3,000 years. He collapses to the ground, pouring dust and ashes over his own head, and clothing in the traditional gesture of deep mourning, tearing at his hair, and crying out in a voice so terrible and full of grief that his mother Thetis, far away beneath the sea, hears him and rises immediately to comfort her son, gathering with her sea nymph sisters around him as he weeps. I want you to imagine this scene slowly and fully, because it is one of the most emotionally significant moments in the entire ancient world's surviving literature. Here is the greatest warrior alive, a man capable of facing down entire armies without fear, reduced completely to grief, lying in the dirt, covering himself in ashes, his cries carrying out across the water to reach his mother in the depths of the sea. This is not a quiet, dignified sorrow. It is total, overwhelming physical grief, the kind that consumes a person entirely, and the ancient poet does not shy away from describing it in its full, unguarded intensity. Thetis, holding her devastated son, reminds him gently of the old prophecy, that if he returns to battle now to avenge Patroclus's death by killing Hector, he himself is fated to die soon afterward, since Achilles' own death has always been tied closely to Hector's in the pattern of fate governing this war. Achilles, in his grief and his fury, no longer cares. He declares that he would rather die immediately, avenging his friend, than continue to live a long life while Hector still walks free, having killed the person Achilles loved most in the world. This is a genuinely important turning point worth sitting with. Earlier in the story, back in his tent during the failed diplomatic visit from Odysseus and the others, Achilles expressed real doubt about whether glory and honor were worth risking his life for. Now, having lost Patroclus, that entire calculation changes completely. This is no longer about honor or reputation or fair treatment from Agamemnon. It has become something far more personal and far more human: grief, love, and an overwhelming need for vengeance against the man who took his closest companion from him. Achilles chooses in this moment to embrace the short, glorious, tragic path his mother always feared for him, not for the sake of fame this time, but purely out of love and loss. Before he can return to battle, however, there is a practical problem. His armor, taken by Hector as a trophy, is gone. Thetis solves this by traveling to Hephaestus, the god of the forge, and asking him to craft an entirely new set of armor for her son, a request Hephaestus agrees to immediately, out of gratitude for kindness Thetis had once shown him. The description of this new armor being forged, particularly the enormous shield decorated with intricate scenes of ordinary human life, cities at peace and cities at war, farmers working in fields, weddings and funerals, dancing and feasting, the whole complex tapestry of human existence captured in bronze and precious metal, is one of the most famous passages in the entire poem, and it's worth pausing on for a moment because of what it represents. Even in the midst of this deeply personal story of grief and coming vengeance, the poem takes time to depict scenes of ordinary peaceful life, as though reminding us, gently, that war and violence are only part of the larger human experience, and that even a warrior about to unleash devastating fury on the battlefield still carries, engraved now onto his very shield, images of the quiet, ordinary world of weddings, harvests, and children playing, the world that war always threatens to destroy. With his new divine armor complete, Achilles finally reconciles publicly with Agamemnon, both men setting aside their earlier pride and anger in the face of the greater tragedy that has unfolded. Briseis is formally returned to him, along with the gifts originally promised, though Achilles, consumed now entirely by grief and the coming need for vengeance, barely seems to care about any of it anymore. Let's follow him now, as he prepares to return to the battlefield at last, transformed by loss into something even more formidable and considerably more dangerous than he had been before. The return and the rage when Achilles finally returns to the battlefield. The poem describes a warrior transformed almost beyond recognition, no longer simply the skilled, proud fighter he had been earlier in the war, but something closer to an unstoppable force of pure grief and fury, cutting through the Trojan ranks with a devastating intensity that the poem itself seems almost frightened to fully describe. I want to be honest here about the nature of this section of the story, because it is genuinely violent, more so than almost anything that came before it, and it's worth acknowledging that honestly rather than glossing over it. The ancient poem describes Achilles killing dozens of Trojan soldiers in rapid succession as he drives toward the city, including a particularly disturbing episode in which he takes captive 12 young Trojan men, intending to sacrifice them at Patroclus's funeral as a form of vengeance offering, a practice that reflects the deep, sometimes brutal customs of grief and honor in this ancient warrior culture, customs that can feel genuinely uncomfortable to encounter honestly today, and which the poem does not ask us to simply celebrate without reflection. There is also a memorable and strange episode during this stretch of fighting in which Achilles, pursuing fleeing Trojan soldiers toward the river Scamander, kills so many men in the water that the river itself, personified as a god in the poem, becomes enraged at having its waters clogged with bodies and rises up to attack Achilles directly, nearly drowning him before the god Hephaestus intervenes with fire to drive the river back. It's a strange, almost surreal moment in the story, blending the natural world directly into the human drama in a way that feels distinctly different from how we tend to tell war stories today. But it captures something important about how completely Achilles' grief has overwhelmed every other consideration, even provoking the anger of a river god through the sheer, uncontrolled scale of his violence. Amid all of this, there is one encounter worth pausing on specifically, a brief meeting between Achilles and a Trojan prince named Lycaon, a young man Achilles had actually captured once before, years earlier in the war, and had chosen at that time to sell into slavery rather than kill. Now, encountering him again on the battlefield, Lycaon begs for mercy a second time, reminding Achilles of their earlier encounter. But Achilles, transformed by his grief over Patroclus, refuses, telling the young man with a kind of cold, exhausted clarity that even the great hero Patroclus, far better than Lycaon, had died, and that death comes for everyone eventually, so there is no reason for Lycaon alone to be spared. He kills him without further hesitation. It's a genuinely chilling passage, and I think it's worth sitting with honestly, because it shows us just how completely Patroclus's death has hollowed something out inside Achilles. The playful, music-loving young man who once spared prisoners and showed real warmth to guests in his tent has been replaced, at least temporarily, by someone numb to mercy, moving through the battlefield with a kind of grim, mechanical fury that seems less like the actions of a living person and more like an unstoppable natural force. Closer in that moment to the river he had just fought than to the boy who once learned healing herbs from a gentle centaur on a quiet mountain. Eventually, the Trojan forces are driven back entirely within the walls of their city, all except for Hector, who remains outside the gates, determined to face Achilles directly rather than retreat with the others, despite the desperate pleas of his father Priam and mother Hecuba, watching from the walls above, begging him to come inside to safety. Let's slow down completely now and walk carefully through the final confrontation between these two men, because it stands as one of the most famous and most carefully constructed scenes in the entire history of Western storytelling. The duel at the walls of Troy. Imagine the scene from the walls of Troy itself. Priam and Hecuba stand watching, along with countless other citizens of the city, as their greatest warrior and last hope for survival stands alone outside the gates, watching Achilles approach across the open plain, his new divine armor gleaming, moving with a speed and purpose that seems almost inhuman. At the very last moment, as Achilles draws near, Hector's courage falters and he turns to run, circling the walls of the city 3 full times with Achilles in close pursuit. A chase the poem describes almost like a terrible, tragic dance, played out in front of the entire watching city, both men driven to complete exhaustion, until finally the goddess Athena intervenes, disguising herself as Hector's own brother Deiphobus, appearing beside him and offering encouragement to finally stand and fight, convincing Hector in his exhaustion that he now has an ally beside him to face Achilles together. It is, in truth, a cruel trick. When Hector finally turns to face Achilles directly and calls out to his brother for support, he finds no one there. Deiphobus never actually arrived. Athena's disguise vanishes, and Hector realizes in that final terrible moment that the gods themselves have abandoned him, that he stands entirely alone against an opponent he cannot defeat. I want you to sit inside this moment for a while, because there is something quietly devastating about it that goes beyond simple battle drama. Hector, understanding fully now that he is going to die, does not collapse into despair or beg for his life. Instead, according to the poem, he chooses to face his death directly, deciding that even if he cannot win, he will not die without at least attempting to fight with honor, to make his death mean something, rather than being cut down while fleeing. The two men finally clash. Achilles, faster and driven by an almost supernatural fury, ultimately gains the advantage and delivers the fatal blow, striking Hector through a small gap in his armor at the neck, one of the few vulnerable points remaining, since Hector is still wearing the very armor he had stripped from Patroclus's body days before. A bitter, almost unbearable detail that the poem includes deliberately. Hector dies wearing the armor of the man Achilles loved most, killed by the very weapon meant to avenge that earlier death. As Hector lies dying, he makes one final request of Achilles, that his body be returned to his family in Troy for a proper burial, rather than left for scavenging animals, a request rooted in one of the deepest fears in the ancient Greek and Trojan worldview, the terror of being denied proper funeral rites, which was believed to leave a soul unable to properly rest in the afterlife. Achilles refuses, his grief and rage still far too raw to allow for any mercy. He declares that he wishes he could bring himself to eat Hector's flesh raw, out of the depth of his fury, a shocking and deliberately disturbing statement meant to convey just how completely consumed by grief and vengeance Achilles has become in this moment, how far he has traveled from the gentle, music-loving young man raised on Charon's mountain. What follows is one of the most disturbing images in the entire poem. Achilles ties Hector's body by the ankles to the back of his chariot and drags it across the battlefield and around the walls of the city, in full view of Hector's grieving family watching helplessly from above. A deliberate act of desecration meant to inflict as much suffering and dishonor as possible on both Hector's memory and his surviving family. I don't want to rush past this moment because it's important, but I also want to be careful, in the spirit of this being a calm, quiet story meant to help you rest rather than to disturb you deeply before sleep, to move through it gently and then let it settle, the way the ancient poem itself eventually moves toward a much quieter, more peaceful resolution. It's worth remembering that even the ancient audiences who first heard this story were not meant to simply cheer for Achilles' actions in this moment. The poem itself treats this desecration with real discomfort, showing us the horrified reactions of the gods watching from Olympus, several of whom argue that Achilles has gone too far, has crossed a line that even a grieving man in his position should not cross. This brings us, finally, to the last major section of Achilles' story as told in the Iliad, one that many readers over the centuries have found to be the most emotionally powerful part of the entire poem, more than any battle, more than the death of Patroclus itself. It is a quiet, intimate scene set late at night, inside Achilles' own tent, and it involves an old man's extraordinary act of courage, and a moment of genuine, unexpected human connection between two people who should, by every measure, be bitter enemies. Let's go inside that tent now together in the deep quiet of the night. Priam and Achilles for 12 days after Hector's death. Achilles continues to drag his body around Patroclus's burial mound each morning in a ritual of ongoing grief and rage, while the gods on Olympus grow increasingly disturbed by his refusal to allow the body proper burial. Eventually, Zeus intervenes directly, sending the messenger goddess Iris to Priam, Hector's elderly father and king of Troy, instructing him to travel personally to the Greek camp, under the protection of the gods, to ransom his son's body from Achilles. Imagine, for a moment, what this journey must have meant for Priam. He is an old man, a king who has already lost so many sons in this long war, now being asked to travel alone, essentially unprotected, deep into the camp of his greatest enemy, the man who has just killed and desecrated the body of his most beloved son, in order to beg in person for that son's remains. The god Hermes guides Priam safely through the Greek camp under the cover of darkness, past the sleeping guards, until he arrives at Achilles' own tent. Let's picture this scene slowly and carefully, because it is genuinely one of the most moving passages in all of ancient literature. Imagine the interior of the tent, lit softly by a low fire, the night air cool outside, the ordinary sounds of a sleeping military camp settling around them, distant voices, the occasional shift and stamp of tethered horses, the soft crackle of the fire. Achilles has just finished his evening meal and is sitting quietly, still lost in his grief over Patroclus, when suddenly this old man appears before him, unannounced, uninvited, and does something utterly unexpected. He kneels down, takes Achilles' hands in his own, the very hands that killed his son, and kisses them, the traditional gesture of a supplicant begging for mercy from someone with complete power over his fate. Priam speaks to Achilles with extraordinary dignity and raw honesty, reminding him gently that his own father, Peleus, is also an old man far away, and asking Achilles to imagine how Peleus would feel in this exact situation, begging a powerful stranger for the return of his own son's body. He says, in one of the most quietly devastating lines in the entire poem, that he has done something no other mortal has ever done before. He has knelt down and kissed the hands of the man who killed his own child. I want you to sit with this scene slowly, without rushing, because something remarkable happens here. Achilles, who only days before declared he wished he could eat Hector's flesh raw in his fury, is moved to tears by Priam's words. The poem describes both men weeping together in that quiet tent, Priam grieving for Hector, Achilles grieving all over again for Patroclus, and in some sense for his own father far away, and for the short, painful life he knows still awaits him, since his own death, as prophesied, will follow soon after Hector's. For a while, the two of them simply sit together in shared grief, an old enemy king and a young grieving warrior, united not by victory or defeat, but by the simple, universal experience of loss. Eventually, Achilles rises, gently helps Priam to his feet, and agrees to return Hector's body. He even orders his own servants to wash and prepare the body properly before Priam takes it home, a final act of respect after so much earlier desecration. Then, in a moment that feels remarkably tender and human, Achilles insists that Priam stay and eat a meal with him before returning to Troy, and the poem describes the two of them sharing food together quietly. The same simple hospitality Achilles once showed to Odysseus's delegation earlier in the story, extended now even to the father of the man he killed. Achilles arranges for Priam to sleep safely in his camp that night, and even negotiates a temporary truce so that Hector can receive a proper funeral in Troy without fear of Greek attack during the mourning period. Let's take a slow, quiet breath here, because I think this scene tells us something essential about the entire meaning of Achilles' story. After everything, after the childhood on the mountain, the disguise on Skyros, the 10 years of war, the terrible loss of Patroclus, and the brutal, consuming vengeance against Hector, the poem chooses to end this particular chapter of the story not with a triumphant battle, but with two grieving men, enemies by circumstance, sharing a quiet meal together in the middle of the night, united by their shared understanding of loss. It suggests that beneath all the glory, all the violence, all the pride and fury that drive this entire war, there remains something more basic and more human: grief, and the simple, aching need for comfort and dignity, even from an enemy. The Iliad itself actually ends here, with the funeral of Hector back in Troy, the whole city gathering to mourn their greatest defender, a scene of quiet, communal grief that closes the poem on a note of sorrow rather than victory. Achilles' own death and the eventual fall of Troy itself are not actually described within the Iliad, but come to us instead through later poems, plays, and traditions that developed in the centuries afterward, filling in the rest of the story that Homer's poem leaves unfinished. Let's follow that story now gently into its final chapters. The death of Achilles according to the traditions that developed after the Iliad, in works no longer fully preserved but referenced and summarized by later ancient writers. The war continued after Hector's funeral, with new Trojan allies arriving to bolster the city's defense, including Penthesilea, queen of the legendary Amazon warriors, and Memnon, an Ethiopian king and ally of Troy, both of whom Achilles is said to have defeated in fierce personal combat, adding new chapters of grief and complexity to his story, particularly in the tradition surrounding Penthesilea, where some ancient sources describe Achilles falling into a strange, sorrowful love for the warrior queen only after striking the fatal blow against her, mourning her death even as he stood victorious over her body. But Achilles' own fate, foretold so many times throughout his story, from his mother's early fears, to the choice at Skyros, to the prophecy following Hector's death, finally arrived. According to the most common version of the tradition, Achilles was killed by an arrow shot by Paris, the same Trojan prince whose actions had started the entire war by taking Helen from Sparta, with the god Apollo guiding the arrow's path to strike Achilles in his one vulnerable spot, the heel his mother had held him by all those years earlier, when she dipped him into the river Styx as an infant, the single place on his entire body left unprotected. I want you to sit quietly with this ending for a moment, because there's something deeply fitting, in a sad and thoughtful way, about how this story closes. After everything, after the impossible strength, the divine armor, the terrifying fury on the battlefield, Achilles' death comes not through some grand, dramatic duel against an equally matched opponent, but through a single arrow finding the one small, unprotected place his mother's love had, in the end, been unable to cover. It brings the whole story back around, quietly, to where it began. A mother's desperate attempt to protect her child from mortality, and the small human vulnerability that no amount of divine intervention could ever fully erase. Even Achilles, the greatest warrior of his age, blessed by the gods, trained by the wisest of teachers, remained in the end simply human, capable of being hurt, capable of dying, just like every other soldier who fought and died on that beach across those long 10 years. The aftermath of his death is described in later traditions as well. His body was recovered from the battlefield in a fierce fight, carried back to the Greek camp by Ajax and Odysseus, and the entire Greek army mourned him deeply, his mother Thetis rising once more from the sea, along with her sister nymphs, to grieve over her son's body, the same way she had comforted him after Patroclus's death, only now there was no comfort left to give. A great funeral was held for him, his body burned on a pyre alongside precious offerings, and his ashes mixed, according to tradition, with those of his beloved Patroclus, so that even in death, the two of them would remain together, buried under a single great mound overlooking the sea near Troy, a resting place that ancient travelers, including figures like Alexander the Great many centuries later, were said to visit and honor. Standing quietly by the shore where the greatest warrior of the Greek world had finally found rest. Funeral games were held in his honor as well, a tradition of athletic competitions meant to celebrate and remember a great warrior's life, much like the funeral games Achilles himself had organized earlier for Patroclus. A small, quiet detail that closes a kind of emotional circle in the larger story. The same rituals of remembrance and honor eventually extended to Achilles himself. There is one more small piece of the story worth including here, gently, before we move toward the end of tonight's journey. After Achilles' death, a dispute arose among the Greek leaders over who deserved to inherit his famous armor, the very armor forged by Hephaestus himself. Both Odysseus and Ajax claimed the right to it, and when the decision was ultimately awarded to Odysseus, Ajax, one of the strongest and most respected Greek warriors, fell into such a deep despair and wounded pride that he eventually took his own life. A quiet, sorrowful postscript to Achilles' story that reminds us, once again, how much suffering and grief accumulated around this long, difficult war, extending even beyond the death of its most famous participant. The war itself continued a while longer after Achilles' death, eventually ending through the famous trick of the wooden horse, a deception devised by the clever Odysseus, allowing Greek soldiers to be smuggled inside the walls of Troy under the guise of a peace offering, leading finally to the city's fall after all those long years of siege. But that particular story belongs to another quiet night, another slow telling, sometime further down the road. For now, let's rest here, with Achilles and Patroclus resting together beneath their shared mound by the sea, and take a little time before we close tonight's story to think gently about what this whole long journey actually means. What remains it's worth taking a slow, quiet moment here at the end, not to analyze the story too sharply, since that isn't really what these nights together are for, but just to sit with a few gentle thoughts before we let the whole story settle and fade into sleep. Achilles' life, when you walk through it slowly like this, night by night, detail by detail, turns out to be a story less about glory than it first appears. Yes, there is enormous strength and skill in it, extraordinary battles, divine armor, and a fury on the battlefield that terrified two nations. But underneath all of that, what actually drives the story forward again and again are much quieter, more universal things. A mother's fierce, ultimately imperfect love for her child, the simple comfort of music and friendship during long years away from home, a devastating grief over the loss of someone deeply loved, and finally, in that quiet tent late at night, an old man and a young warrior finding, even amid unbearable loss, a small measure of shared human comfort. It's worth remembering, too, that this story has survived for nearly 3,000 years, passed down originally through generations of oral storytellers long before it was ever written down, told and retold around countless fires, very much like the quiet mood we've tried to create together tonight. Families and communities gathering to hear once again about this young warrior, his terrible choice between glory and safety, his devastating loss, and his eventual quiet return to compassion in the presence of a grieving father. There is something genuinely comforting, I think, in knowing that people have been telling this exact story in one form or another for so many centuries, across so many different cultures and languages, each generation finding their own meaning in it, their own reasons to keep it alive. Achilles chose a short life, remembered forever over a long life, quietly forgotten. And whatever we make of that choice today, sitting comfortably in homes he could never have imagined, in a world utterly transformed from his own, it's clear, at the very least, that the second half of the prophecy came true. He is remembered still, 3,000 years later, his story still being told softly, quietly, to help someone somewhere fall asleep at the end of a long day. And with that, we'll gently let this story rest for tonight, the way Achilles himself finally found rest beneath that quiet mound by the sea, alongside his dearest friend. The sound of the waves, the last thing either of them would have heard. The same waves that still move quietly along that same shore today. If you made it this far, whether you followed every word or drifted off somewhere back around the walls of Troy, I hope this story gave your mind somewhere calm and interesting to rest tonight, far away from whatever noise or worry the day might have left behind. If you're new here, and you enjoyed spending this quiet time with me tonight, I'd be really grateful if you considered subscribing, so you don't miss the next slow, quiet story we tell together. It genuinely helps this small channel continue doing this kind of long, unhurried storytelling. And if you're still awake, I'd love to know, whenever you get the chance, where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it happens to be there right now. There's something I find quietly comforting myself in picturing all the different places this story might be playing right now. Some of you just settling into bed as night falls where you are, others perhaps listening on an early morning commute, or during a quiet afternoon with the shades drawn. Wherever and whenever you are, thank you for spending this long, slow evening with me and with Achilles. Sleep well, and I'll see you again soon for another quiet night and another old story, waiting patiently by the fire for whenever you're ready to hear it.